Coming up on Arirang News, the South Korean government and lawmakers agreed to expand health and safety insurance to more workers in the so-called special employment sector. More than 250,000 people will be added to the rolls. Some of Korea's most innovative companies have surged into the stock market's top 10 this year in terms of market cap as older blue chips take a beating from uncertainty in the global economy. And President Moon Jae-in calls once again for reform to the prosecution. It's not an issue that divides people, he says, but something that unites them in a process that requires wisdom. It's 4:00 p.m. here in Seoul. Thanks for tuning in to our afternoon newscast. I'm Devin Whiting. President Moon Jae-in has once again called for reform of the prosecution, instructing the government and parliament to listen to what he says are the people's demands. Take a listen.
다양한 의견 속에서도 하나로 모아지는 국민의 뜻은 검찰의 정치적 중립 보장 못지않게 검찰 개혁이 시급하고 절실하다는 것입니다. 법무부와 검찰도 엄정한 수사를 보장하는 한편 법 개정 없이 할 수 있는 개혁에 대해서는 속도를 내주시기 바랍니다.
This was in today's weekly meeting with his top aides, addressing the recent demonstrations, some demanding reform and others calling for the expulsion of Justice Minister Cho Kuk. President Moon said he doesn't think those are signs of division, but it would be undesirable for it to lead to severe confrontation, and the people must now use their wisdom to resolve the issues according to procedure. The president also assured the people that the government is doing its best to repair damage caused by Typhoon Mitag, as well as to prevent the further spread of African swine fever. With talks having broken down over the weekend between North Korea and the U.S., North says the ball is now in America's court and that Washington should withdraw what the North calls its hostile policies. Kim Yo-sun has this report.
North Korea has expressed its intent not to engage in denuclearization dialogue with the U.S. until Washington withdraws its hostile policies. Just a day after the bilateral talks between Pyongyang and Washington broke down in Stockholm, the North's foreign ministry issued a statement that explained Washington failed to bring any new package deal and was sticking to its existing stance. It also called on the U.S. to withdraw hostile policies that threaten the safety of the regime and undermine its people's right to survive and develop. The statement also emphasized that the fate of the future denuclearization talks depends on the U.S. attitude, and the deadline for talks is the end of this year. The remark can be interpreted as the regime's willingness to ask the U.S. to lift international sanctions while guaranteeing the regime's security. The North's chief negotiator Kim Myung-gil reportedly expressed doubts about whether Washington can bring alternative plans within 2 weeks, as proposed by the meeting's host nation, Sweden. Before boarding a plane for Beijing and Moscow, Kim stressed that Pyongyang has no desire to engage in, quote, sickening negotiations with the U.S. Such a remark follows the U.S. State Department saying it had accepted Sweden's invitation to return for more discussions with the North in 2 weeks. Kim Yo-sun, Arirang News.
In the U.S., there are differing views as to why the Stockholm talks broke down. Some say the Trump administration simply didn't offer what the North had expected. There's also the view that this was a typical North Korean negotiating tactic. Some also say the U.S. might be looking too eager. Kan Hyung-woo tells us more.
U.S. media outlets were quick to offer their take on lack of results from the working-level talks in Sweden. The Washington Post raised the possibility of the North Korean side coming to the negotiating table with higher expectations, with the U.S. appearing to send signals of a changed stance. For one, President Trump dismissed John Bolton, his former U.S. National Security Advisor, who was well known for his hawkish style toward the North. On top of that, Trump had mentioned a new method for the denuclearization talks with Pyongyang. With President Trump likely to face a bumpy election campaign in 2020, the chief executive of the Korea Risk Group, Choi Do-kar, also said it appears the North may be hoping that the combined effect of the ticking clock and American fears of long-range missile and nuclear tests in the year ahead will stimulate a significant shift in U.S. strategy at the last moment. However, VOA looked at the breakdown as if it was just a regular tactic for North Korea. Mintaro Oba, a former U.S. diplomat focused on Korea, was quoted as saying the North Koreans have a long history of being tough negotiators, willing to cancel or withdraw as a tactic. He added this isn't necessarily the end of working level talks, saying it's far more likely North Korean officials conceived the breakdown ahead of the meeting, so it was not a spontaneous decision. The Wall Street Journal voiced concerns over the U.S. looking too eager to get a deal done. Quoting a former CIA analyst and North Korea expert at policy think tank the Rand Corporation, Soo Kim, the report said Washington risks looking too overzealous given the State Department's statement about leaving the door open for future talks. The report also included analysis from Professor Lee Sung-yun, a Korea expert at Tufts University, who said North Koreans take their time and keep raising the stakes, adding that Pyongyang has the upper hand at this time. Kanyu, Arirang News.
And in the Stockholm talks, some experts say North Korea and the U.S. might have been unable to move ahead because they had two very different timelines. Oh Soo-young reports.
North Korea and the United States are working on different timelines to hammer out a deal on denuclearization. That may be the essential problem that led to the breakdown of the recent working level talks in Stockholm.
We're very focused on sanctions relief and on some kind of security guarantee. But I think there's a third kind of maverick piece, and that may be playing into these working level negotiations as far as these summits and what would be required to hold the summit. And that gets to the second point, which is timing. You know, when I look at these statements, especially the North Korean statement is very focused on the timing. And actually, if you parse their phrases, they were frustrated that they didn't hear enough from the Americans, and the Americans stressed the importance of having lots of meetings.
While North Korea has set the year-end as the deadline for the US to break the deadlock in the stalled negotiations, President Trump has said repeatedly that he's not in any rush. Most analysts say Trump's own timeline is likely set for November 2020, in time to give him a boost for the next US presidential election. But to clinch a deal that's worth supporting, experts say Trump needs to get involved and fast. Dr. Mark Barry says no negotiations between the two sides have succeeded on a working level without intervention from the top leadership, citing how it took former President Jimmy Carter to convince Kim Il-sung to freeze the North nuclear program in exchange for light water reactors and heavy fuel oil in 1994.
My perception is that the North Koreans have a lower view of this State Department's negotiating capabilities than did the North Korean diplomats under President Clinton or the North Korean diplomats under George W. Bush. I think personally that the United States needs to treat the Korean issues more as the United States had treated the Arab-Israeli issues as an honest broker, having Camp David summits as was done in 1979, the Camp David II summits between the Israelis and the Palestinians that President Clinton invested 2 weeks of his time in. That's how it has to be done.
It's unclear whether the US can convince the North to return to Sweden for talks in 2 weeks' time. But experts say any further discussions may require a personal touch from President Trump. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, the leaders of North Korea and China exchanged letters on Sunday as their countries mark 70 years of diplomatic ties. In the letters, they promised to make those ties even closer. Lee Seung-jae has more.
North Korea's state-run Korean Central News Agency reported Sunday that the leaders of the two communist allies exchanged letters of greeting earlier in the day to mark 70 years of their countries' bilateral ties. In his letter to President Xi Jinping, Kim Jong-un described the establishment of their diplomatic ties as an epical event, adding that their friendship will be immortal. The North Korean leader added Pyongyang-Beijing relations have entered a crucial period, and he promised to carry forward the excellent traditions for their friendship that is, quote, envied by the world. In his letter to Kim, President Xi called their relations a valuable asset that binds the two countries, adding it's the consistent and firm policy of China to consolidate and develop its relations with its ally, as the North was among the first countries to establish diplomatic relations with China. The two sides have been strengthening their ties in recent months, with the two leaders holding 5 rounds of summit talks since March last year. That includes President Xi's visit to the North Korean capital in June, marking the first trip by a Chinese head of state to North Korea in 14 years. Earlier on Sunday, the North state-run newspaper The Nodong Shinmun issued a commentary vowing to develop bilateral ties with China regardless of the international situation. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
And Japan is apparently hoping to hold a summit with North Korea before the year is out. The newly appointed head of Japan's National Security Secretariat, Shigeru Kitamura, said so in an interview with Asahi Weekly, set to be released on October 11th. They're already in talks, he said, to set up a summit. Given the organization's confidential nature and closeness to Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, experts see the comments as a sign Abe does want to meet with Kim Jong-un. It's something he's said previously he would do with no preconditions. The former commander of U.S. Forces Korea has sought to clarify concerns regarding the upcoming transfer of wartime operational control from Washington to Seoul. In a written interview on Sunday, General Vincent Brooks said President Moon Jae-in's term, which ends in 2022, is not a factor in determining the timeline. Rather, he said it depends on certain conditions being met, such as Seoul's ability to exercise operational control and its readiness posture in decision-making. Brooks also said it's important the transfer is not affected by a political timeline, since it could lead to further North Korean provocations. He dismissed concerns that UN Command would replace Combined Forces Command, but said there needs to be an expansion of the UNC in terms of managing the armistice agreement, facilitating a peace treaty with North Korea, as well as mediating pledges from the international community. The South Korean government and lawmakers from the ruling party have agreed to expand occupational health and safety insurance to more people in the so-called special employment sector, generally irregular jobs like chemical transport, door-to-door sales, and home tutors. Meeting at the National Assembly today, the two sides decided to work on changing the law to give benefits to an additional 270,000 people in the sector if they get hurt or fall ill on the job. Currently in special employment, the law insures around 470,000 people, who account for just a quarter of the total 2.2 million people in the sector. On the Korean stock market, some companies dealing in the most cutting-edge technologies, including those of the Fourth Industrial Revolution, have outgrown some of the blue chips this year in terms of market cap. Partly economic factors, including a slump in semiconductors, holding back the older companies. Yoon Jung-min explains.
The stock prices of some of South Korea's biggest firms have witnessed some dramatic ups and downs this year due to increasing volatility centered around local bio and 5G companies. According to Korea Exchange, out of the top 10 listed companies by market capitalization on South Korea's benchmark KOSPI at the end of 2018, only 7 were still there as of last Friday. Telecommunications giant SK Telecom, Korea Electronic Power Corporation, and steelmaker POSCO have dropped out of the top 10, replaced by Hyundai Mobis, a firm increasingly focused on autonomous driving technology, and others. Samsung Biologics is back in the top 10 after a temporary slip when it was under investigation due to fraudulent accounting allegations. South Korea's major web portal Naver soared from 10th place to 4th, while Samsung Electronics and SK hynix remained in 1st and 2nd place, respectively.
Overall, during the past year, Korean stock markets have been mostly affected by the trade conflict between the U.S. and China. Also, some companies were affected by slowing demand for chips. That wasn't good for Korea, which is heavily reliant on IT exports.
Bio companies on the secondary tech-heavy KOSDAQ have also seen a greater degree of volatility. They include Kalong Tissue Gene, which was suspended from trading in late May due to its controversial gene therapy Invosa. More firms involved in the 5G tech sector made their debut in the KOSDAQ's top 10, including KMW, a local manufacturer of wireless communication equipment. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News.
And it's time now for an in-depth look at the market news at this hour. And for that, I'm joined on the line by Mr. Daniel Yu, Global Strategist at Yuanta Securities. Mr. Yu, thank you for coming on today.
Thank you very much for having me today.
So this week, we're supposed to see another round of high-level trade talks between the U.S. and China. That'll have a significant bearing, of course, on the direction of stocks. We've seen some big swings in recent days. How's it looking out there?
Sure. As you know, that U.S.-China trade talk is expected to start on high level on 10th and 11th of October. The Trump administration, including Gov't, says that there might be some surprise deal that might come out of this meeting. But many seems to not believe into this because in the last several months, most of the indication that some things are going right, actually it really didn't come out right. So the market volatility has actually increased quite significantly. But nevertheless, we do think that the Trump administration needs to come up with some kind of deal before the end of the year in order to help the Trump to win the next election process. So we do think that some small deal size might be happening over this trade talk. And both sides of the countries, the U.S. and China, probably needs to come up with some kind of deal that would help both the head of the states. If you look at the overall market, it seems that it is showing some recovery. U.S. market was up 1.4% in general. The European market was up about 0.86%. Nikkei is slightly down, and Chinese market is closed for the whole week.
Certainly the calculus changes the closer we get to the elections. But this year, another topic that's come up is the OECD and others looking at a new paradigm for international taxation. This is to update the system that's been used for so long, and a major part of it is dealing with the fact that companies have a large digital presence where they don't have a physical one. What are the changes they're looking at and why?
Sure. If you look at this district tax issues, the current debate is not about the tax avoidance or the existence of stateless income. But it is rather that about the divisions of tax rights among the countries who consider that their citizens contribute to the profits made by some digitally focused companies. And most of these companies are generating profits in an unconventional means, so it is difficult to decide where the profits are generated. So there is continuation of conflicting perspectives among the nations in terms of setting the settlement rights. If you look at the OECDs are discussing on this, and also the European countries, even amongst themselves, that they have conflicting views where the profits to be booked to be taxed. But in any case, the effort will be made because most of the companies are moving into this direction. So unilateral tax measures will be decided. I think that this is something that is a big change coming forward in the future.
It'll be interesting to watch. Now, speaking of those issues and others, we've got the U.S.-China trade talks this week. What else do we need to be watching?
Sure. The key factor that we need to watch is that the U.S. economy is slowing down, and we've seen that a lot of the numbers coming from the U.S. in terms of PMI numbers and various other numbers. But the question mark is that whether or not it is a Goldilocks phase where fairly reasonable growth with a fairly reasonable inflation numbers, or whether it's going to the recession territories. So clearly the numbers, minutes from the Fed and the ECB monetary policy will be keenly watched. That will be coming out this week. And also the U.S. inflation numbers will be coming out this week. And that will give us some indications whether on the 30th of October, the Fed will cut another interest rate. Also, some of the numbers like Michigan consumer sentiment numbers will coming out, as well as UK GDP figures and also German factory orders. And all these are needed to decide whether the global economy is going to the recession or whether it is showing a moderate slowdown in terms of the growth rate.
All right, Mr. Yu, we'll be watching all of that. That's where we're going to have to leave it today, though. Thanks so much for coming on, as always.
Thank you very much.
Now, Samsung Electronics is one of the places engineering students most want to work. Samsung ranked 8th in this year's list of the world's most attractive employers, released by global employer branding firm Universum. It's the company's best ever ranking and the 4th year in a row that it's made the top 10. The list was based on a survey of roughly 130,000 engineering students in 12 countries, including South Korea, the U.S., China, and Japan. U.S. tech giant Google came on top for the 10th straight year, followed by Microsoft and Apple. The unionized workers of Seoul Subway Line number 9 will go on a preliminary strike today, ahead of an actual strike set for Tuesday and Wednesday. The walkout comes as union members launched a so-called Work to Rule protest last month, calling for irregular workers to be given regular status and for the workforce to be expanded. To minimize delays for commuters, the Seoul Metropolitan Government says it will bring in additional workers so trains run normally. Seoul Subway Line number 9 transports an average of 500,000 passengers a day. Now, it's been raining all day in Seoul, which has cooled things off considerably. Meanwhile, there's a typhoon out in the Pacific that could head this way. Right now, it doesn't seem likely, but if it does, it could still be extremely powerful when it gets here. Our Choi Jung-yoon tells us more.
Autumn is here, with a steady stream of rain drenching South Korea throughout the day. The Korean Meteorological Administration said that the capital region can expect up to 40 millimeters of rain, while Gangwon-do province will see just 5 to 20 millimeters. There's also a high possibility of frost on Wednesday as temperatures fall as low as 5 degrees Celsius. Meanwhile, a tropical storm has formed off the east coast of Guam. That's Typhoon Hagupit, and as of 10 a.m. Monday, it was 550 kilometers east-northeast of Guam and will travel northwest towards waters southeast of Okinawa, Japan by the end of the week. The typhoon is forecast to intensify in the western Pacific Ocean, with a huge amount of vapor provided from the warm ocean water. Then it might grow into a super typhoon later in the week, which experts forecast could be the biggest and the strongest of the year so far. A super typhoon has winds of at least 234 kilometers per hour, which is powerful enough to bend a steel tower. If it stays on its projected path, the typhoon will travel towards Japan's Kyushu Island, but there is a low possibility of it impacting Korea. The government is keeping an eye on the storm as it gains strength and could shift course due to the differences in surrounding atmospheric pressure. By the middle of the week, it should be clearer whether the typhoon will have an impact on the Korean peninsula. If Hagupit does have an impact on Korea, it'll be the 8th typhoon this year to do so. That's a record number of typhoons to affect Korea. The name Hagupit comes from the Philippines and means fast or swift. Choi Jung-yoon, Arirang News.
And that brings us to the end of this newscast. Thank you for watching. More live news coming your way at 7 p.m. Korea time.
What's going on around